So that's perfect. Right, without further ado, I'm just going to jump straight in. So we've got a wonderful workshop ready today, all about the strange world of the internet and how we're supposed to cope with it currently. So this is all going to be kind of, my focus is obviously on media literacy. That is what Shout Out UK does. It's what we're kind of known for, political and media literacy. And we kind of believe that every aspect of this, you know, in climate change included, you kind of have to have a really good knowledge of how to combat sort of fake news, people call it, on the internet. So it's really essential that we have these tools put in place to be able to deal with this. And this is kind of what we're going to go and discuss today. So just a big quick question. And again, if some people aren't on it, I just want to see, where do people get most of their news from? If you don't want to use Menti, then you can also type it into the chat box of the Zoom as well. We can get that, but it's just a quick question to see where people get most of their news from. So you've already got social media. Quite a lot of people are responding on that. Someone's put newspapers. So that's quite good. Getting lots of responses now. See, this is good. So as we're already seeing right now, social media is pretty much where I'd say predominantly people tend to get their news from. That's a big problem, especially in the world of journalism. If we're all relying on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, maybe even TikTok in some cases, to tell us how we get our news. So we need to be very reactive. So this is a really good demonstration to everyone here that newspapers are kind of, I don't want to be mean to the newspaper people, but they're not something that a lot of people go out and get anymore. More often than not, you'll find people scrolling, and that's how they get their news. So we have social media that's involved in the sort of news realm, and that's really interesting. Of course, we have TV and radio still, but you know, this is important. So yeah, I'm gonna move on to the next question. But this kind of demonstrates where we're at the point in time with journalism at this moment. So we're a connected world, essentially, and that's the whole world, and that's 4.57 billion people are active on the internet. And if I suppose if you say there's about 8 billion people in the world, that's pretty much half are on the internet. This is by 2020. It's only expected to have more and more people on the internet, and that throws up a lot of questions to us, to journalists, to democracy, to all these different types of things we have to think about, and how can we do that? Northern Europe ranks first with 95% of internet, but also China, India, and the United States are, ahead of all other countries in terms of absolute numbers of internet users. So, across the whole world, people are using it for news, and that's something we have to all be aware of when, as journalists, and thinking about this more widely. So. Quick little quiz section for you today. I just want to start the countdown. This is just let's do this. Okay, my internet's not working for a second. Right. I'm gonna have to move on. What you want to do with this is you want to answer fast as possible to get more points. It seems to be that it's not working quickly, so move on and just jump on straight to this. We'll come back to that later. So when we're talking about media literacy, what do we mean? Media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media in a variety of forms, okay? And today, everyone needs to become more efficient at filtering what they see and hear. And the big question we have is where do we start from this? And the first question you should always ask yourself, and ask everyone really, is this real or not? When you're on your social media, when you're reading something, it's no longer, where has this come from? Is this a trusted source? Is it real or not? And that's something that is only going to get worse as the years come on with deep fakes. So these are videos that are completely fabricated, completely fake. And what is happening is that this sort of misinformation, this sort of fake news, is getting a bit more savvy. So meaning it's getting a bit more technological. So we're having to deal with this a big point. So really the first thing you want to be aware of when using social media and collecting and going to the news is this real or not? And then we want to get the wording right. So we've talked about fake news, and fake news is something that's, you know, really highlighted, and it's been highlighted by certain people in the sort of spectrum, but we kind of want to avoid using fake news as a catch-all. And one of the reasons for this is essentially certain people, Donald Trump included, and other people have kind of co-opted, and what I mean by co-opted is they've taken the word fake news and they've replaced that word as in anything that disagrees with me is fake news. Right, and again, from the UK, I hear this a lot with young people. They say, oh, that's fake news, to something that they disagree with. So the word fake news has actually been broken almost. And as you can see from a few tweets here, I didn't have to type in many to find this, but it's the term of, you know, the fake news hates me. And what they're saying is that fake news and mainstream news, they're one of the same. So you can't trust mainstream news anymore, which has to abide by ethical journalism, and you should only trust news that paints me in a certain positive picture. This is where the problem comes. So we want to try and avoid using the term fake news. That would be my proposal here, is that we kind of avoid that and we look to new words and new sort of thought processes in terms of this. And, you know, in terms, I'm from the UK, so the UK government kind of wants to replace the term fake news, and they want to use the agreed definition, which is misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And with this idea of having a good shared definition, and, you know, this will give clear guidelines for companies, organizations, and governments to follow as well. So what I'm proposing here is let's not use the term fake news, but let's really just jump on and try and use misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation as well. And this is something that is quite essential, I think, in really getting to grips with how we deal with this. But you may disagree with me and think that fake news is something else, and I'd love to hear your thoughts if you type them in the chat box or anything like that, if you disagree with me. So what does misinformation and disinformation mean? We're going to focus on disinformation and misinformation today. Malinformation is a really interesting point. You know, it deals with like leaks, harassment, and hate speech, but I'm going to need a full workshop to be able to really get to grips with what malinformation is. So we're really going to focus on these two subsets today. So the way you would understand disinformation is information that is false and deliberately created to harm a person, social group, organization, or country, right? And what you need to remember here is the intent. So it's deliberately created to harm. The person who has created this knows it is fake, and they're doing it deliberately to spread and cause harm. Misinformation is different. This is information that is not created with the intention of causing harm. So there's a bit of a difference, the intention behind it. If you imagine someone who's like, I'm aware this is fake, I'm going to share it, disinformation, and then misinformation is someone who's not aware, and it might just be a bit of ignorance. So you might want to think about a Facebook post. People who create the Facebook posts to people who share those. The creation of the Facebook posts, knowing it's fake, or, you know, knowing it's not real, is disinformation. And then someone unwillingly just sharing it and getting a bit panicked, they're spreading misinformation, which is where you've got the two sort of subsets happening on there. So again, I'm going to keep repeating this word. Disinformation is information that is false and deliberately created to harm a person, social group, organization, or country. And where does this come in terms of climate change? So this is what we're really focused on today. There's been a lot of scientific evidence concerning that climate change, you know, especially the producers of climate change, in fact that it was, you know, kind of deliberately kept out of the way, so that these big producers, so BP, Chevron, and all the sort of carbon producers, they kind of developed, or at least participated in, campaigns to kind of block policies designed to reduce heat trapping emissions. So these big, you know, businesses knew that climate change was a problem, but they kind of spread a disinformation campaign to stop people from being aware. And that's where the climate change comes in. So a lot of people are spreading disinformation. They willingly don't want people to be aware that climate change is a problem. So they are actively campaigning for you to not, you know, to not do that, whether it's for profit or, you know, other types of reasons, but more often it is profit because they've got a stake in the oil industry or the gas industry. They're aware that it exists, but they're spreading information that it doesn't. And that's where the big disinformation aspect comes into this. So this is kind of the area of climate change we're thinking about, is the real, you know, intentional, you know, working together to stop people from believing in climate change. And that went on for quite a while, especially after the 80s when it was clear. This has been happening for quite a while, the spread of disinformation. Should we see if this worked? Okay, right, well, we can move on to that. Okay, so fossil fuel company leaders knew that their product to people and but still chose to actively deceive the public and deny this harm. So we've got the fossil fuel companies as big disinformation campaigners. And this is kind of what people were aware of. They knew that, you know, if you think back to the tobacco industry, this is what the good parallel. Everyone kind of, you know, in the 60s, they weren't aware that tobacco caused all, you know, lung cancer and things like that. But then they slowly, you know, they had scientists that were saying, right, there's a problem. And then what they did is they tried their best. They worked with politicians, they worked with government, they did all the policy framework to try and, you know, sow confusion. Is it the cigarettes? Is it the lifestyle of other people? What is it? And to this day, we still have people smoking, even though the medical effects of this are quite clear. So you almost want to think of climate change as kind of similar to this, in terms of climate change, in that people are aware that it exists, but they're kind of ignoring the negatives of this. And that's something that we need to think about. And as I said before, you know, we kind of had this big campaign of deception that happened in the past, but it's still going on today. And this is why we need to be very aware. So most major fossil fuel companies did actually, you know, their main finders of climate change. They have kind of said, okay, we can't fight against the science. And many do say that they are trying their best to cut emissions, but some companies kind of are starting to spread misinformation. And what they do is they try and push the focus. So what you want to think about is that it's not rampant deception, but it's delay tactics. That's what the focus has been made on right now. Rather than just outright, this doesn't exist, it's let's delay it, let's delay, let's wait, you know, wait 10 years, wait 15 years, wait 20 years, just worry about it in the future. And that's an active way of trying to push this as well. And this is something that is quite big, that we have to think about, is that it is shifted. It's kind of, the deception has now shifted to delay tactics. And that's kind of what we want to worry about. I'm aware that the Mentimeter isn't working very well, so I am sorry about that. But has anyone got any questions so far about disinformation?
Sa amo kasi nga kadama sila, di ba? Oo, kailangan pa rin. Kasi dati, nagkasya ganito, pwede na nga daw. Tapos nung pinarasis nila, kailangan
yeah, so if you've got any questions or anything, do feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand or anything like that. And I'm sure one of the hosts will be able to do that. So this is something to know. So if you think about disinformation, again, what I said is the idea that it's deliberately created to sow and, you know, cause harm. Misinformation is different. Misinformation we've all, at some point in our time, have probably done, all right? And this is something that, whether it's just sharing a post and you haven't fact checked, at least once we've all done something like this, because no one fact checks everything that they've seen. It's, you know, it's quite impossible with all the information that's coming at you. So again, disinformation, information that is deliberately created to cause harm. Misinformation is information that is false, but not created in intention of causing harm. One more go at seeing if this I'm really hoping it will. I do apologize. So let's try. Let's see if this can work. How many people viewed climate disinformation ads on Facebook? What do we think? Do we think 7 million, 2 million, 60, 7,000, 8 million, or 16 million? And this is people viewing climate disinformation ads on Facebook. So we've got quite a mixed road. So yeah, it's actually 8 million. So when we're thinking about disinformation ads, we're thinking about ads that were actually created and put on the internet, knowingly trying to spread climate change isn't real and these concepts. And 8 million people viewed this. And that's a really big problem that we have, in that social media comes into this as well. So we've got 8 million people viewing ads that are telling them that climate change isn't real. And this is where the sort of the problem comes in to this. And whoever Dr. Evil is, very good. So that's something that we and Watson that we want to think about. So Facebook is at fault. Essentially, social media companies are at fault for this, and they have to take some form of the blame, I feel. But also, we shouldn't blame them fully, but this is kind of what we're talking about. So Influence Map found 51 climate disinformation ads running in the US during the first half of 2020 on Facebook's platforms. So that was, again, just 51 like climate disinformation ads telling them climate change isn't real. It was on Facebook, and it gained 8 million impressions over a 6-month period. So only in 6 months, 8 million people were able to view the fact that climate change doesn't exist and all this sort of climate misinformation and disinformation, right? This is where the problem of social media really comes into this. Facebook has tried to help, however. It has tried to kind of move on from this and try to, you know, change things, especially, I don't know if anyone saw the elections as well. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram have all got a bit heavy-handed with misinformation at the moment. And Facebook has created this Climate Science Information Center to see what the experts say. So they are trying to find ways to manage this. And promote up-to-date climate information rather than disinformation or misinformation that is spread by people. So we do have the social media companies trying their best to help, and that's something that we need to be aware of as well. So Facebook admits climate misinformation on its platform is a problem, but it's only taken half measures to stop it. So again, we have to think about how much, and this is the debate that you'll have inside your heads when you talk to each other or when you're writing articles. You need to start to think, when you promote them on social media, where are they going, who's going, and is there a massive disinformation ad or a misinformation ad that's just basically reducing your article to nothing? Or what are you seeing and who's seeing them, and are they targeting particular people? Because we also have to remember social media companies use certain algorithms to be able to understand who we're seeing and who's seeing information. So it's a lot of things we have to think about, and we have to work with social media companies. So just want to see where people feel. Social media companies need to do more to deal with climate misinformation, disinformation. So if you strongly agree that it should be up to social media, you can put 5. And if you're not sure, you can put 3. So this is just to see what everyone thinks, and it will be moved. So a lot of people so far pretty much saying that it's up to social media companies. Maybe we've got someone, yeah, so we've got a couple. I think it's about 4.7. So again, this big discussion about social media companies really comes in. What are they doing? How are they doing it? So we've got about, a couple of you think, so we've got 3 in the middle, not too sure. 1 strongly disagree, but the majority of you are strongly agree. So, and again, that's something we have to think about. It is go drop-in, so that's interesting. So I've got a couple more people maybe in the middle, a bit unsure if it's fully up to social media, and that's something that is quite essential when we have to think about this. So that's kind of when we're thinking about misinformation and disinformation, we also can't ignore the role and responsibility of social media. And that's why I always pose this question is, what do we want from them for this? Now, the big point we want to answer is, how does misinformation spread on social media? And we had a really good research of this, and I probably will send the link so you can all read it because it's very good. But what they did is they hired analysts to track climate denial conversations on Twitter. And they found a specific group of people responsible who spread the most disinformation and misinformation. And what they observed was that the climate denial group were actually 4 times louder in like the amount of tweets that they proposed compared to the scientists. So even though there were less people that were being climate denialists on social media, they were actually louder and talking about it more and responding to different types of tweets and whatnot on Twitter. So that's a big problem as well. You've got a few scientists who are clearly doing factual information, but if someone is louder and they're doing more tweets per second, they're actually getting heard more because of the way Twitter works. So that's a real big problem there as well, in terms of how can we fight against climate denial when they're so loud, essentially. So that's a big question that we also have, is how can we manage that? And if you see the picture here, you can see, the yellow are the climate denialists, and they're kind of spreading throughout, and they're quite big compared to the sort of pro-science area on this side. And that's, again, something we have to think about. Often as well, when it comes to climate change and climate denialism, there's also, they don't just climate change. You know, a lot of climate denialists who are quite loud on Twitter and other social media platforms are quite loud. They're like anti-COVID-19. So they kind of, this lack of understanding of science spreads. So they kind of promote a really anti-science stance. So as you can see here, so when COVID-19 became a really big talking point, they moved on from climate denial and to start denying that COVID-19 kind of exists, or that, you know, it's promoted by the government and things like that. And then they also moved on to discredit Black Lives Matter, and they used certain like hashtags and they jumped on them. So you have these people who are very anti-science and will spread in these communities and talk about, and they're not something that we have to think about. In fact, that it isn't just climate change, but it is as well focus. COVID-19 is a really big one. I couldn't not bring up the QAnon, is the idea that climate deniers are kind of sharing content, hashtags, and interacting with QAnon conspiracy movement. And the reason why we're so worried about QAnon is kind of like, it's because it's a conspiracy theory. There is no fact behind this movement of people. It's the idea, of course, that, you know, there are all sorts of problems that were Satan worshippers in the government and big media, and you can't trust anyone. So they're promoting that you shouldn't trust mainstream media, and you should, you know, really focus on people that kind of say that fake news is anything that disagrees with them. So you have this real big problem of climate denialists moving into other conspiracy movements, and how can we manage that, the fact that they keep moving to other conspiracies? It's a real big problem. One case study I found is, I don't know if any of you know, but Naomi Sebit is kind of the conservative Greta Thunberg. And she's been propped up as kind of the conservative version of Greta Thunberg. And she was, you know, very big at one point, but she kind of moved into QAnon. She moved to the conspiracy world a little bit. And she talked about, you know, the pandemic, Jeffrey Epstein, Pizzagate, all this kind of very big conspiracy. She, you know, originally was propped up as the anti-climate change, and now she's moved into the other areas. So again, it starts off by almost climate change, and then it spreads, and you fall down and you kind of take on these things, especially on social media. So this is something that we need to think about in terms of, we all follow scientific backing responses on Twitter and social media, but the other people will be following people like Naomi Sebit. They might not follow Greta Thunberg, or they might not follow scientists, but they'll follow her, and they'll follow Donald Trump and people who don't necessarily believe in climate change. So there's this big gap of people only interacting with people who think climate change doesn't exist, and us only interacting with people who think climate change does exist. And we never really meet on social media. So that's a big problem in trying to deal with this. And we really need to think, how can we kind of have this discussion and conversation with these people? I hinted at this before, and I'm sorry if I'm going quite fast, but this is quite, I want to have some questions as well. But what we need to think about, as I mentioned before, is that often they will struggle to deny climate change exists completely. People online will really struggle that. There's just so much science back in that. It is quite hard. But what they do is delay. And this is called like the discourses of climate delay. And they kind of use these different ways of kind of shoving the climate change question onto someone else. So, and it's about pushing responsibility. So if we go through this, we'll go through a couple of questions that we often get, and you might have, you know, I know that loads of people are from all across the world here, so there'll be different climate questions that people will come up to you with, but you always, as, you know, in the world of like reporting and journalism and dealing with climate change, you need to be aware of the questions so you can fight against them more effectively. That's the top tip I'd have for you, is getting yourself educated so that you can kind of fight against this almost. Again, as I said before, you want to understand the obstacles being placed and then make sure that you have a good response in hand. And this is online as well, when dealing with climate denialism. Yeah, I just saw that question. The problem is algorithm on social media. It prefers bigger engagement. So that's definitely a thing. It's algorithms on social media are a big problem. And as I mentioned before, we never meet. You won't ever really see much climate denialism because we will follow scientists and we'll follow different people, whereas they will follow climate skeptics and people who climate change, and we'll never meet in the middle. And the algorithms will make sure that we're separate. So we need to find a way to make sure that we can start to cross over and meet in the middle. So that's definitely a good point. So this question comes up, and it's often one that we'll see more often than not. Ultimately, it's individuals and consumers who are responsible for taking action, right? When we talk about disinformation and almost the companies in charge, the fossil fuel companies, this is what they'll tell you to do instead. So rather than do policy action against fossil fuel companies, they'll say, what are you doing? What are you as a human doing to stop this? And that's a big problem. So it's all about our responsibility rather than the responsibility of big business to deal with climate change. On the surface, I think it's good. I think we should all take responsibility, but we cannot, we cannot ignore that, 100 companies are responsible for 71% of all greenhouse gas emissions, right? So we really need to kind of take this question and almost respond to it like, okay, fair, I should do my part, but so should the big businesses. And that's where this conversation comes. This is shoving the responsibility away from businesses onto us and saying we need to deal with it, when in actual reality, the conversation with us and big business and government. And we kind of need to work together. So this question comes up a lot into dismissing climate change, being like, well, what are you doing? How much plastic are you doing? Do you still eat meat? And it ignores the bigger questions, which are, how can we manage this? So this is one that often comes up quite a lot, and it's just redirecting responsibility. So you really want to manage this question. What about China? This question comes up all the time. You'll see it on social media when you're trying to tackle this, and this comes up with a lot of misinformation and disinformation, especially after COVID-19. People will say there's no point in dealing with climate change because China are the ones that are at the top. And they're the ones that are, showing out so much carbon dioxide. This is a problem. Again, it's about every country could make a version of this argument. If every country said, well, I'm not going to deal with it until China deals with it, then nothing will ever get done, right? And that's the core problem. There will be no hope for change if we all wait for someone else to deal with it first. We could then look at the rest and say, well, China could say, well, I'm not going to deal with it until the US deals with it. And then there's no hope. So this question, again, excuses responsibility and just tries to place it onto someone else. Everyone needs to work together. All countries need to come together and come up with policies and think about it. And just by saying, well, I'm not going to do anything until that country does it, doesn't help anyone. It's the whole world that's going to be affected by climate change. And we need to start all taking a little bit of responsibility for this. So that's really something. What do you think about engaging people younger and older to use references? In terms of engaging people, I think that the younger generation, the younger generation are actually more susceptible to a global outlook. So they kind of get on board with looking at the world and understanding, because they're so connected through the internet, that they can really engage with, well, we need to do this now, otherwise this country is going to be affected first. So when you're engaging young people, you need to kind of do an almost global look at how the world shifts. With the older generation, I find that thinking about almost like your country and what you can do to help your country is kind of the way you should go, because like doing the little things, so like, here's what you can do at a local level, here's what you can do at a national level. So there's these all sort of top tips that you kind of need to deal with. The question about recognizing fake news is hard, because first you need to be aware misinformation, disinformation exists. But the fake news, the top tips of dealing with it, we're kind of going to go through that. We're going to go through my review session at the end. But it's just being aware of they're using the same hashtags. They're in the sort of different environments and algorithms. But we'll really go into how to spot and recognize fake news a little bit later on. But that's a really good question to ask now. What I'm telling you now is how you can respond to these sort of climate denialists on social media at the moment. Because these are the questions that you'll have to respond to often when dealing with climate change and people who often don't believe in it. And this question about what about China comes up all the time, and people struggle with how to respond to that question that props up. So another question that comes up as well is we've already declared, this is the idea, okay, we've finished now, there's a climate emergency, we've done the targets, let's move on. Why are you still talking about it? And that will often happen when you write articles and you see things online, just go, we've done it, why are you still talking about it? We've got more important things to talk about, we've declared it, stop. That is a big problem. Targets, firstly, aren't policies. There's, you have to ensure that each country has their, if they say they're going to do a target, they then need to put that in their domestic policy. So it needs to go through, the sort of, politics. It needs to go through the government. It needs to go through whatever it is, and they have to actually put down a policy domestically. And it was also announced that humanity missed every single one of the 2010 the World Wildlife and Ecosystems, and that's because they were targets and not policies. You can sign up to something, but that doesn't mean that you have to actively do anything. So we really need to work hard in making sure that we don't just say we're going to do something. It has to be put in the politics. So when will it be before it's too late to turn back? I'm not sure what that question's asking, so if you could add on to that, that'd be amazing. So just to clarify that question, but I'm more than willing to answer that. So taking action on climate change will generate huge social costs. The most vulnerable people in our society will suffer the most from increased taxation. Now, this question comes up a lot on social media, including Twitter and Facebook and all these places when again, climate denialists. And what they'll do is they'll say, what you're saying with climate change is going to cost the most vulnerable. So it's going to cost, the people who don't have a lot of money, and society, they'll suffer. You're not really caring about everyone. You're not thinking about the bigger picture. This is what I'd call a straw man argument. And what you're doing is you're basically you're basically having a non-existent version of climate policy. So you're saying, if you take action on climate change, then that's going to cause the people with no money to have problems. It's moving there's no need for that. That's not what's happening here. And again, it's about shifting responsibility. It's saying, if you want to do policies on climate change, then you don't care about the vulnerable people. And again, what it's doing is it's pushing this narrative, this conversation that people are going to suffer from climate change policies. And that's what people are worried about. And you have to think to yourself, if you are a working class person and you've got, a 12-hour job and you come home, do you really want to worry about climate change? But if you suddenly see an article promoted that says climate change policy means that you'll be taxed 20% more, of course they're going to be angry. Of course they're going to get upset because they don't, they may have not experienced climate change effects at the moment. So this is a really worrying, proposal, and this is what they're going to do. And this is what they're promoting against you. So this is something that is a big problem in terms of dealing with climate change, is that they'll just say that you're harming people by putting policies in place, which isn't, the truth. But this is what people are worried about. And that's why we have to be aware that these people are saying this, and how can we kind of fight against that.
Lucy, that's such a good point, because it links to a question that Adam just asked, with regards to vulnerable people. When will it be before it's too late to turn back, especially for those people?
So yeah, is that what the question was asking?
Is when will it be too late to turn back?
I mean, the scientists will say 12 years. The scientists will say we've got 12 years to kind of like sort everything out for climate change. But in terms of, you know, dealing with things on media literacy, and then we're actually having a big problem now. And like, we can never really turn back online. Everything, all this climate denialism is online right now. I think that there's kind of like, if you think about this as in two questions almost, if that's, so why fake news and conspiracy theories seem to be more appealing to people? Is it a problem of communication strategy and technology used to make up fake news? Do you know, I think it's also a lack of science literacy, almost the understanding of science. If you think it's easier to, climate change isn't a positive thing to think about, is it? It's much easier to say they're lying to you, because you know that's easy for someone to take on mentally. Again, if you've got a family of 4, or you're thinking about your next paycheck, or you're trying to, you know, you've got a very busy job, you don't really have much time to think about climate change in all of its problems. More often than not, people don't. So these conspiracy theories are they slip into your consciousness and be like, well, they're lying to you, they're making it seem worse than it is. And I think that that's something that needs to be talked about as well. Communication strategy, I definitely think it is a big point. Scientists and their articles aren't accessible. If you think about it, like I've tried to read lots of like big, you know, researching from climate scientists, really explaining the science behind it. And unless you have a good education behind you, or even, you know, maybe even a master's in climate understanding, it's going to be tough to read and tough to take in. So people need to be very accessible with their words when writing these things, and engaging with people online. More often than not, the louder climate denialists, they aren't using scientific lingo. They're not using, you know, dropping words. They're just saying it's a lie, it's fake news, it's not real, there's nothing going on. And that's the problem. They're using very simplistic language that people can understand really easily, compared to scientists who may be using language that, you know, some people struggle to get up with. Is it the guilt of people that they get appealed to fake news or climate denial? I think what it is that fake news and climate denialism, more often than not, is one, a lack of education. And again, as I said before, it's not a lack of education as in that they're not aware of the world. It's just that conspiracy theories thrive on fear as well, and they thrive on making things very simple. So climate change, you're talking about really, you know, quite complex scientific understandings, and you're also talking about something that you can't really see. Look, some countries, we are not affected by climate change at all, really, at this moment in time, or at least not as affected as other countries are. And at the crux of it, you've got people who say climate change is when the world heats up. So why is it raining in Britain? That's a complete lack of understanding of weather and climate. It's just, it's a real lack of not being aware of the two differences. So people often get very confused between those two type things. So I think what we're doing now, whereas we're really having to explain climate change in very accessible ways so that people can go, oh, okay, I quite understand that. And also not just talking about the negatives. You want to make sure that the positives are talked about, like what people are doing positively to help climate change, because that will help this sort of push. If it's all negatives and, you know, 12 years, everything's going to go wrong, this has happened, then why would people want to engage? It causes this sort of fear. So really, I think that it needs to be a change, and in focusing on what are we doing positively to help? You know, what are the scientists coming up with? How are the people managing to deal with this? The media needs to kind of change the story. I definitely think.
Yeah, that's a good point again, Lucy, because somebody's just asked if it's the people's fault that they fall for fake news and climate denial. So do you think it's actually the media's responsibility and not the people consuming it?
Yeah, I definitely think the media has a big part to play in a lot with this, because, you know, that's how people get climate information. They get it from the media, right? Because there is, you know, unless you choose to take climate change and choose to focus on it, that's where you're going to get information. So the media has a big role. And if you're always talking about the negatives, people don't want to engage. But if you start to talk about the positives and how people are doing so much to help climate change, then of course people want to join the community. Of course people want to help and support. So there really needs to be a shift in the narrative, I definitely think. So, question to everyone, kind of gone through it, but who do you think should stop the spread of misinformation? Do you think it should be the social media companies, government, individuals, or a mixture of the three? I'd be interested to see what people think. So we've got someone who responded a mixture of the three already. This is interesting, yeah, because quite a lot of you did say that social media companies should take a lot of responsibility. So this is quite good. Yeah, we've got individual responsibility as well, but I did think it'd be a mixture of three. So we've got more individual responsibility than social media, and pretty much everyone saying that it's a mixture of three. And this is the big debate that will happen now is, you know, social media was not expected to be to regulate media, like what we take in on mainstream news. It was never meant to be set up for that. It somehow happened that it is now having to think about misinformation and disinformation and stopping climate denialism, but it was never set up for that. So obviously that social media isn't regulated, and that's a big question. What can journalists do when politicians and companies seem to have stopped caring about being called liars, since they can call it fake news or bias? That's a good question. So, I mean, this is about accountability, I think, is the question here. So I think journalists need to consistently kind of remind people that, you know, they're not just, politicians shouldn't lie. I think that this expectation now that we almost all accept. We're like, yes, politicians lie, companies are like, you know, have lied to us as well. And it's like, okay, we expect this. I think that's a narrative that we should completely destroy. And I think journalists and the media play a part in trying to turn that. So it's almost like saying, okay, you know, we have to hold them to account, which is of course what journalists have been doing for ages, is constantly holding people to account and holding businesses to account. And I think that there needs to be this real push of just, you know, they've lied and this is about climate change, let's hold them to account. Let's make sure, you know, if they've lied consistently throughout their term, then we remind people of this when it comes to elections and things like that. And if a company has done it, let's offer alternatives. You know, the world of big business doesn't mean that we, you know, all have to do that. So Amazon's a big point of this, in that Amazon was told, you know, that their workers weren't good or they didn't really care about climate change. So people started to look for more ethical sources and they found them. So there's a really push for media to try and force the conversation through. Yeah, definitely awareness is needed to kind of stop this. So there's lots of things. I really love these questions. They're really quite gripping. So yeah, overall, we've got a good mixture of three. We can't really just rely fully on social media companies. We can't rely on government itself to regulate. And we also can't just expect everyone to have a good understanding of misinformation and disinformation. It needs to be a good mixture of three, and we all need to work together. So it's like the media, the government, social media companies, and people together need to work to find a way to stop this. And this conversation needs to keep happening, especially now with like a pandemic. It's forced this almost into the limelight. I'm going to quickly give you a little bit of practical techniques here of how you know, we deal with you know, dealing with fake news or misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation online, and what we do, how we can review it. So it's got this anagram here, which is, you know, reputation, evidence, verification, intent, emotions, and weigh it up. Right? I'm going to go through that a bit more. So here it's kind of in practice. So I got sent this. No, I got shown this in class of a young person who didn't really like climate change and found it too much. They said to me, climate change people are too intense. And they were like, they're too vegan, that it's just, you know, they need to calm down. And then they showed me this story and they were like, a Greenpeace activist gets arm bitten off after hugging a white shark, right? And they found this very funny. They were like, this is, of course they would go and do that. So we then had to think to ourselves, right, where has this come from? First step is reputation. Who has created this? and why. So you look at the top and you've got the URL and it says archive. Immediate warning sign to me, they've had to archive it, it's been taken down for some reason. So that's the first step, is checking where it's come from. Has it come from The Guardian? Has it come from the BBC? Where has it come from? Is it mainstream news, or is it some small not news to be really aware? Next, we need to think to ourselves the evidence, right? The evidence is that a man had his arm ripped off by a shark after trying to hug it. Okay, it's kind of a bit weird, but you have heard weirder stories. So again, you have to kind of think to yourself, okay, what is the evidence of this? Have they got links? Have they found, have they done an interview with them? Have they got links to other articles that say the same thing? We're looking for evidence to support this, not just a picture of a shark in a corner. That isn't much evidence, so we need a bit more. Then we need to be able to verify it. Again, this is where your sources come in. So this is why it's really important to source other people and finding the image. Where does this image come from? Has it been fabricated? Who's using this image? All these types of things that we're looking into. So you kind of have to think about this. Then you want to think about your emotions. So more often than not, people will they clearly from this, what they're saying is that Greenpeace activists are a bit silly and, they go out hugging sharks. So they don't really know what they're talking about. So immediately you need to think about your emotions. If you were a climate denialist and you thought that the, people who believed in climate change were very weird, you would immediately go, yeah, I can see this happening. If you were us, you'd be like, I'm a bit skeptical about this. I'm not really sure that's fair. And you would immediately think about where your emotions are. And often people forget that it's our own biases that really come into this. The intent. What is the intent of this article? Why have they created this? Why are they, what is the point of this article? Is it to entertain? Is it to inform? Is it to talk about Greenpeace? These are big questions that we need to think about. And then lastly, you need to weigh it all up. Essentially, you need to kind of go through the reputation, go through your evidence, verify emotions, figure out the intent, and then weigh it up. And you will be able to do this quite quickly. It takes practice, but you will be able to see articles and social media online and go boom, 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 right, before you share and spread misinformation, or before you start getting angry, you can go, right, let me do this review in practice. It takes time, but you will get faster at doing this. And this will really help in kind of seeing if something is misinformation or disinformation. I always want to give a few practical tips. Really pay attention to the domain. There was a site with The Guardian once which had The Guardian in all caps, and they used the same sort of logos and everything, but it was just that the URL was a bit different, and you can see that. So you need to really make sure that you pay attention to the URLs. They're quite important. So as I said before, because it's an archive, they clearly had to take it down. So I was able to kind of be like, I shouldn't really trust this. You can always do a reverse image search, and you just right click on the image and search Google for it. So I did this. I wrote in Greenpeace shark arm, and immediately Snopes came up, fake news, this is fake. Like lots of things were telling me this is fake. And that's just something quick that you can do to be able to see where this image has come from and where has it been used before. And that's something that a lot of people forget about, especially with fabricated images. And the last sort of idea is engaging in conversation. If you see people, sharing fake news, biased articles, sharing misinformation, be a friend and kindly tell them it's not real, and don't shy away from these conversations. The only advice I would give you with this is maybe not do it publicly. You can always just do a personal message to someone and say, hey, do you want to have a conversation with this? I don't think this is real. I think this is a bit of a problem. Here's why I don't think it's real. Read this and then get back to me. And that often helps, because most of the time people who are in this sort of climate denialism don't have conversations with people who disagree with them. So that's always good to engage in conversation. This is the best one, also the most hardest one, but it's the one that I would always recommend to people. If you are struggling and you want really good fact-checking guides, I would always recommend these. These are very focused on the UK. I'm sure there are tons across the world, but First Draft does do things in different languages as well, and they kind of do deep research. They are the one to go to if you kind of think something might not be real. and these are the fact-checking organizations. And there's like a list online now. I think if you type in fact-checking guides, and they'll give you a list of different countries and things as well. So these definitely, I promote these if you're worried that something is not real and you just want to do that extra check, the extra step. This is what I do. I always try to check these first if I'm worried about something. I've gone through that quite fast. We still have a couple of minutes if you want to ask any more questions about anything. I'm quite fair. I really enjoyed your questions throughout though. They were really informative and made me think, so that's good. Yeah, thank you everyone. I hope that's giving you a bit of an understanding of the information landscape that we've got currently and how we can manage this. But yeah, do feel free to ask any more questions if you've got any.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was awesome. Very informative. I have a question maybe while other people are thinking. How has the conversation of maybe social media kind of trying to manage misinformation or disinformation, has that kind of come against the idea of free speech and like you should be able to say whatever you want to say versus spreading stuff that's not true?
Yes, so that's a really, really amazing question. A lot of people use the free speech argument and they'll be like, why can't I say this? And there's also the argument of, you know, how do you not know that this isn't real? That's on you. Like if I'm sharing something that's clearly not, you know, it's clearly misinformation and you don't get that, that's your fault. I think that the question here is disinformation is kind of a huge problem because it's deliberately created to cause harm. And I think that's where the social media companies are coming in. How harmful is this spread of information and who is it directing harm towards? I think climate change is a really interesting question because climate change, misinformation and disinformation, you know, there is an understanding that we have to be aware of this and we have to fight against. But again, when change starts to get more intense, we'll worry about it then. So I think they're more worried about disinformation and misinformation in terms of it affecting democracies and affecting like politics. They haven't really focused too much on climate change, but it's going to be a bigger conversation. And I think that freedom of speech, you know, if you're spreading misinformation, you're not doing it knowingly, then you just need to be educated. But if you are spreading disinformation and you are knowingly doing this, then you are choosing to cause harm. And your freedom of speech at that point it doesn't matter. That's where I would stop the gap. Is education and ignorance versus wanting to cause harm to gain profit, maybe. I've just seen the chat. It's quite, if there's any questions. I hope that answered your question, by the way.
Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting conversation to have, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think freedom of speech is really something.
Yeah.
I'm so excited people seem to have enjoyed the webinar in the comments section, and I just want to say that we actually talk about things like this every day on our Instagram page, especially. I'm thinking quite a lot of people who are following might have Instagram, and you can see at the bottom of the screen we've got our Instagram title there. It's shoutout UK_official, and we have a fantastic social media manager on our team called Spencer, and every day he will make something about a global event. So it might be about election fraud, it might be about, today it was about Boris Johnson saying something controversial about Scotland. Every day he explains something and you can learn a bit more and hopefully use some of what you learned in today's session as well.
Yeah, that's Ellie, always promoting.
Excellent. So thank you to both of you, to Shout Out UK. All of the participants here can go check them out. And yeah, on that note, I think we can end this webinar. You can see the recording of it on the Wary YouTube channel. And on our website, you can also see upcoming webinars. So thank you all for joining, and have a good rest of your days.